Okay, so I'm Myroslav Shkandrij, and Revolutionary Ukraine is a book that will be coming out shortly with Routledge. Basically, it looks at four revolutionary cycles that have dominated Ukrainian history in the last 100 years. So it's a century of revolutions. I guess I was stimulated to do this because there were a lot of books come out, a lot of texts were published on the 100th anniversary of the 1917 revolution. And as anyone who studies Ukraine knows, Ukraine tends to be, well, has until recently tended to be an afterthought when people discussed the 1917 revolution. And it seemed to me that it was time to write a book in which the experience of revolution in Ukraine was looked at more carefully and from the viewpoint of insiders. So basically, I look at the 1917-21 period. Every one of these periods I look at from a Ukrainian point of view or from an insider Ukrainian point of view. So I looked at that first, and then I looked at Stalin's second revolution, as it's sometimes called, or counter-revolution, if you like, 1928 to 1933. And then I looked at the nationalist movement and the nationalist attempt at a revolution, late 30s to 1945. And then in the fourth cycle, I looked at the Euromaidan, what came before, and what came immediately afterwards. So these are the four big upheavals that have transformed Ukraine, that have really made contemporary Ukraine. And another thing that stimulated me was, I think, the Euromaidan revolution. There was a poster during the Euromaidan revolution, a very successful one, a very famous one, called Ukraine, titled "Ukraine is not Russia." And this 100 years of history, this 100 years of revolution, seemed to me to give the answer, give an explanation of why that poster appeared, why that slogan appeared. It actually appeared first in 1917. So 100 years later, you have the same point being made, and history catching up, especially Western readers of Ukrainian history, catching up to this phenomena of Ukraine. Where is this country? Why did it suddenly appear on the map? Why do we know nothing about it? So I decided to write this book, which brings the history of revolutions in Ukraine to the contemporary English language reader. I have to say that some of these articles had been published previously, about half of the text, 10 chapters, about half of them in different forms had been published elsewhere, but I updated them. I made them more relevant to what's going on today and put them together. So basically that's it. And the other aspect of the book is contemporary culture wars. All these periods, these are flashpoints in history, and they're very controversial. So part of the book is talking about contemporary culture wars, or memory wars, if you like, and how these very controversial periods are viewed both in contemporary Ukraine and outside. This is one of the great and very interesting aspects of Ukrainian history, for me in particular. No matter how Ukrainians were put down, I mean, certain generations were almost the leadership of certain generations was almost totally removed. They seem to keep coming back with demands for statehood, for greater independence. This is a really fascinating phenomenon. And I think to a large extent, this has never been thought about in terms of 20th century history. So yes, I think I would agree. The first chapter I look at is actually the early Bolshevik histories of Ukraine, of the revolution in Ukraine. And these are very rarely looked at. They were written, first of all, in the immediate post-revolutionary years, 1920, 1923, and then they were rewritten in 1925, and again late in the 20s and early 30s. The Bolshevik Revolution was, in a sense, incomplete in that it promised certain things to Ukrainians, and there was a struggle within the Communist Party of Ukraine for the rights of Ukraine to be a republic, the rights of Ukrainians to have their own language, to have their own cultural development. And these Bolshevik histories show that. They actually show conflict within the party over these questions. And then they show how gradually the early histories were quietly lost, were quietly forgotten, were quietly pushed aside. And by the way, these were written, some of them at least, were written by Jewish members of the Ukrainian Bolshevik Party. So Jews who were pro-Ukrainian, if you like, or who painted an image of the Ukrainian revolution that was sympathetic to Ukrainians. Now, so I began with that, and I guess that is a good way of describing it, as a revolution cut short or ended in a way that denied what the original impetus was. And then I think the next part, the Stalinist counter-revolution, really was an attempt to roll back the gains. So that leads then to the nationalist revolution. The nationalists, however you define them, you can define them as Democrats. I mean, the majority nationalist grouping in Galicia were Democrats. They were not right-wingers in the sense that the OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was. However you define them, they were watching what was happening in Ukraine. And this Stalinist counter-revolution, if you want to call it that, really generated their response. So you have one revolution leads to the other, and there's a constant sense among Ukrainian intellectuals and Ukrainian intelligentsia of unfinished business. We still have to do what we set out to do at the beginning. And so today, after independence, people are catching up on this history. It seems to me anyway, that people are catching up on this history, that they are reviewing it, that they are trying to make sense of 100 years of turmoil, 100 years of struggle, and 100 years essentially of revolutionary activity. So there is this idea that they're putting together a history which explains why Ukraine has always been a hotbed of revolt, and why it continually comes up against, in the 20th century, mainly Russian attempts to pressure it, but also not just Russian. I mean, there are there was the period, the interwar period, when Poland was also a force in suppressing, the national movement, and so on. Well, part of it was just looking at texts that had never been, I think, given enough exposure. So these early Bolshevik texts really had never really, to my mind, been analyzed or integrated into the research. So that aspect of it was going back over books that should be better known, and they throw a different light on things. But part of the reason was because I got interested in Jewish Bolsheviks and Jewish Ukrainians and Jews who were sympathetic to the Ukrainian movement as a contemporary issue. So I looked back on Ukrainianization and Jewish attitudes towards Ukrainianization, and sort of began integrating that part of Ukrainian history. But there was archival material that, as you know, has become available, and that archival material has changed the way people look at the suppression of the drive for greater self-determination in the 1920s. So one of the chapters I have written jointly with Olga Bertelsen, and that is heavily based, almost exclusively based, on research into the former KGB archives, mainly in Kharkiv, but also in Kiev. So the SBU archives, which are now available. They're not available, the secret police archives are not available in Russia, but they certainly are available in Ukraine. And a lot of that research is based on the people that were arrested. Many of them were called nationalists, even though they could have been members of the Communist Party. It didn't matter. Anybody who was viewed as not towing the line in Moscow, or pro-independence, or too independent-minded, was called a nationalist. So that was very heavily based on archives. And so I guess I put together what you call granular research, reviewing certain texts in a new way, with new research into the archives, and updated a lot of the history based on just the more recent books published by historians. What has always fascinated me has been the drive of Ukrainians to transform their society. In each of these waves, in each of these periods, Ukrainians threw themselves into an attempt to transform the world they lived in. And this has always been a powerful motivation for Ukrainians, and something that I think others don't understand. I mean, it looks to many people like some sort of collective psychosis, so it gets branded nationalism, but it's a drive for self-determination, self-expression of your own identity. This, what I said at the beginning, this idea that Ukrainians are trying to say, we're not Russia, we're not Russians. So the drive to transform society throughout these periods is one of the things. The other thing is this constant conflict with Moscow, constant conflict with an outsider who wants to portray your society in a certain way. Either Moscow or proxies of Moscow rule, the Kremlin. I think that sort of comes through. Another thing that I was very much aware of as I was writing this, and I kept thinking about, was the fact that Ukrainians have had a really bad deal in the 20th century. This has been a society that has, people have tried to engineer this society over and over again. And as anybody who knows Timothy Snyder's book knows, from the First World War, from 1917 until the end of the Second World War, it was just a killing ground. Millions of people died. Millions of people were imprisoned. It was a very repressive society. And that did not go away after the Second World War. Ukrainian society recovered and then was ready for another explosion and another drive for independence at the end. So I suppose it's sort of like Antaeus, touching the ground, getting strength from the earth, the soil, and then rising again. These are the kind of ideas that I was mulling over as I was writing this book and delving into why all this took place. That's a very interesting question. I would answer it by saying that the preconditions were there at different times, and particularly in the 1920s. The preconditions were definitely there, and there was a chance. And it was going in the direction of Ukrainians really organizing their own society, taking control of their own society, and developing their own society to a large extent. But the preconditions were then removed. Things began to go wrong. Setback was Stalinism, period of attacks on the national intelligentsia, the national leadership, the Ukrainianization drive, and so on, and a deliberate attempt to pit that society, elements of that society, one against the other. I don't think the preconditions were there during the Second World War. That was really an attempt, almost a sort of kamikaze attempt by some people to fight against incredible odds, impossible odds. But I have a different view of the UNO, the Ukrainian Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the UPA than some people do. I think that they were hoping that things would happen, that things would turn around, that things would, in the international situation, that things would evolve in a different way, and that there might be a chance for independence. I don't think that really was a revolution that was on the cards at that particular time. Although one has to say that people didn't know how things would turn out by the end of the war. I think the preconditions were certainly there, as we see in 1991. You could argue that Ukrainians were lucky, but it didn't take them very long to begin organizing and to mount another drive for an independent statehood. I began in literature, and I've also got another book coming out on avant-garde art in Ukraine. I've also become a sort of a cultural historian, if you like, a historian of art, and that gives me a different perspective on things. I don't quite have the sense of despair, maybe, that or pessimism that some people have, because I tend to see a development, a constant development, a movement towards self-assertion, towards self-confidence. And I think that partly comes out of studying the development of literature, the development of art, the contributions that Ukrainians have made in these fields. So I'm a little, I'm not really a historian in that sort of, in the way other people are. I'm not in the history department, for starters. So I do have a more optimistic attitude. Also, I do believe in facts. I know that there are different ways of putting those facts together and ways of seeing the bigger picture, and those conceptualizations are where the debates take place. That's where the controversies happen. But you can settle, I believe that you can settle a lot of that just by looking at the facts and just by collecting those facts. And that's what I've tried to do. I read the people I disagree with. I read their point of view, but I expect them also to read my point of view. And one of the things that Ukrainians, I always have said, and I feel strongly, Ukrainians need to put facts on the ground. You have to build a case. You have to convince people. And you do that by writing good scholarship, by writing a view of history that is based on research, work in the archives, understanding the facts. And that's why I said at the beginning that I tried to give an insider point of view. So look at what did Ukrainians say and do in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, and in the post-independence period. So give the point of view from the Ukrainian insider. Because very often people are coming from a different scheme. They have a different scheme, often a scheme that has been absorbed from reading Russian history, imperial texts or imperialist texts. I mean, this has been the dominant current in the West, and it's only now that this is beginning to change. On the issue of uncomfortable history, controversial history, every single book I have written, people have warned me that I would have trouble. This was dangerous ground. And it happened when I wrote about the 1920s, the literary discussion of the 1920s and Ukrainianization. At that time, that was not a popular subject. Khvalyavy was not a well-known or a popular subject. It happened when I wrote about Ukrainian-Russian relations, a post-colonial analysis, if you like, of Ukrainian and Russian cultural debates. It happened when I wrote about Ukrainians and Jews. It happened when I wrote the last book on Ukrainian nationalism. People always said that this is something that will not go down well. But I have to say that I have not faced any, negative responses. There have been critical responses. There are always things that one can learn, and these books are made to stimulate a response anyway. But it's been a sort of my own personal drive to go into those areas that are controversial and that make people feel uncomfortable, because I think that scholarship has to find, first it has to find a terminology. It has to find the words to explain and analyze certain things. Secondly, scholars have to find conceptions and create a discourse in which people feel comfortable to approach and exchange views. If you create a framework, if you create the right language and the right conceptual uh, frameworks for discussing things, you then allow people to have these, to come forward and say what they think. One of the frightening things about scholarship is actually fear. When people are afraid to be open, to discuss things openly, it can lead to psychological damage, but also cultural damage. So I was very sensitive to the fact that Ukrainians didn't want to talk about Jews, or some Ukrainians didn't want to talk about Jews. And in the scholarship, there was nothing about Jews until I started reading about this, and I saw that there was a whole array of things that could be talked about, and there was a whole history that was actually very positive. It wasn't all negative. And the same thing with nationalists, nationalism, the OUN, the UPA. There's this sort of fear of discovering how awful it was. Well, why don't we study it and find out what actually happened? I was surprised to find things in the OUN's history when I wrote that book that were, that explained what happened in ways that people had never told me about, that I'd never read about. So actually, a couple of the chapters in this book deal with that period, the late 1930s and the 40s, and they try to break new ground by tackling what until very recently has been viewed as you said, an uncomfortable, controversial, and dangerous topic. I think that's, for me, that is an attraction. No, it's something that draws me, because here you have an opportunity to say something, to explain something, to discover something, go when other people have not gone. I'm not going to tell you everything that I wrote in those chapters, but there's stuff there that I was really surprised to find myself. And it's this sort of strange sense of an invisible drive, an invisible hand pushing people in a certain direction that is quite fascinating. Was when you're in a position of weakness politically, you have to be clever, you have to be crafty, if you like. And I think a lot of what happened in the 1920s was people in the leadership positions pushing for a certain line, but knowing that they had to be careful, that there were certain limits, and exploiting the openings that were given to them. They were crushed in that sort of counter-revolution of Stalinism, but there was an attempt by some people to hold the line, to not go beyond certain concessions. I think it was. I think the late 30s, 40s was an extremely difficult period, and I think that's where, because the options were so limited, that's where some people, like the OUN, for example, went into an agreement or a semi-agreement with the Germans, to hoping that they would be given leadership of a state that the Germans would help them to create. And then a similar kind of opportunity opened up in 1991, which people gradually moved into. So in politics, you make your own world, you make your own future, but you don't make it you don't choose the conditions in which you make it. So you have to always be able to adapt. And again, that is a fascinating subject, why this keeps happening, or why this keeps going on, and why in each generation things occur that pushes this process forward. Yeah, well, I think everybody does when they write a book. You get excited by certain things you've discovered. So yeah, the 1920s, these early histories were something that I was amazed by, that I didn't think had been given enough air. Olga Bertelsen and I wrote that chapter on the uh, the interrogation rooms of the NKVD. That was a revelation. What was said, how people were, how they manipulated people, how they got people to confess, you know, and what went on. That was, I mean, every one of these chapters for me was a discovery. One of the chapters is about the Galician press in the 1930s. What was written about in Galicia, which was then part of Poland, about what was going on in Ukraine. The nationalist underground too. All of these, every one of these chapters, I think, were for me a kind of a, in a sense, a bit of a pushback against what other people had written, and a discovery of new materials, and then an attempt to put things together in a way that challenged some preconceived ideas. One of the things that has happened recently, and let's say in the last 20 years or so, is Ukrainian studies have become mainstream. It's become a field that many different scholars from different countries are now interested in. So we have, there's a lot of consensus across the board on many issues. And there are very good scholars now in Germany, for example, doing primary research and digging through archives in Poland and North America, in Ukraine. There's a lot of good work being done, and we build on findings and on research that's done elsewhere. So one has to first of all say that there's been we now have a new situation in which a contemporary generation can draw on research in different languages in different places, and we can have conferences and discuss all sorts of things. But there are these flashpoints, and these flashpoints are the ones where there is disagreement. I would say probably that the most difficult periods are the most difficult issues are the Second World War and Ukrainian nationalism during the Second World War. Even there, though, there is a lot of that say Polish historians and Ukrainian historians and Western historians in general. I mean, Ukrainian historians are also Western historians. Polish historians are also Western historians. You know, it's not quite as simple as national boundaries, national identities. But there is a lot a lot of places, a lot of issues on which they see eye to eye. Grzegorz Motyka was one of the leading Polish historians in Poland on the OUN, and he says that there's a lot of ground in common between Polish and Ukrainian historians. The only real problem is the Volhynian episode, the massacres in Volhynia in 1943. That's in his view, it's the major stumbling block. The Holocaust is another big issue, and that's an issue in which there's quite a lot of consensus coming out of Ukraine. I mean, Ukrainian historians, German historians, and others. There are still some areas that need more research, and there are still areas that make people feel uncomfortable. But I think there's an overview that's emerging. The big issue, the biggest problem is with the Russian historians, not the emigre or the Western people in the West as much as some of the people who are writing in Russia today. There's, I think, a certain, how's best to put it, there's not enough dialogue. There's not enough of a conversation going on with those historians, and it would be a good thing if we could have conferences in which they participate and issues in which we could spend more time discussing things. There's different things going on there. They also have to. They want to travel. They want to spend time in Russia. They want to use the archives in Russia. They have contacts there. They have family there. There's a whole range of things which makes you cautious sometimes about what you say. And I think more importantly, they tend to very often either ignore Ukraine or not see Ukraine from the inside, the way people in Ukraine today would like to be seen, or the way Ukrainian historians would like them to think about the country. So there's a certain silence there, which is also, I think, a bit damaging. But I have to say that, if you study Russian history, you study Russian literature, there have been many, many very outspoken people in Russian intellectual thought, in Russian culture, Russian history, who have been very critical of their governments. They have been quite outspoken. And if people love Russian culture, Russian literature, they should learn from that. They should learn from the courage and the outspokenness and the clear thinking of their own scholars, major writers, and critical thinkers. So there's a lot there that they can draw on. And that actually is one of the things that also has inspired me. I've taught. I'm in Slavic studies, or I have been until my retirement, and I taught Russian literature regularly for many years. That's something that I feel that contemporaries who simply say they love Russian culture and then associate that with loving the state in its contemporary form, you're actually not reading Russian literature. It's not what the writers say and said. This is not a book. It's not a thesis that I am, married to and that I am pushing. It's an exploration of related topics. And, as in all my books, it's an attempt to sort of push the boundaries of what we've gotten used to thinking, and to sort of unsettle people a little bit and get them thinking about different things. But also, it's an attempt to challenge a certain kind of historical perspective. It's an attempt to get people to think within a different framework and to step outside that Russocentric or Sovietocentric view of the world. I mean, how many years, how many decades have gone by, and all we hear about the 1917 revolution was that it was Bolshevik, that it was October Revolution, that it was the Russian Revolution, that it was a revolution in Petrograd. None of this really was relevant to Ukraine at the time. It has shaped the view from the outside of Ukraine. And so what my book tried to do was to reorganize that, reconceptualize that framework a bit, and to challenge some of the people who have said that the October Revolution was the greatest thing that happened in the 20th century, and the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. I think that there's a need to rethink that. Pleasure. Nice talking to you. Thank you. Thanks for doing this.